Good morning, everybody. My name is Yoon Young-kwan, Professor Emeritus of Seoul National University. I served as Foreign Minister some time ago, 15 years ago. And first of all, I'd like to congratulate the Megyoung Media Group and Chairman Jang Dae-hwan for the successful opening of the 19th World Knowledge Forum. I witnessed the rapid growth of the forum in the last 18 years, and now it has become one of the most prestigious intellectual fora in the world. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's my great pleasure and honor to moderate the session for General Herbert R. McMaster's speech. Considering the current situation on the Korean Peninsula, I cannot think any better person from the US policy circles than General McMaster to speak on the North Korean nuclear issue and peace on the Korean Peninsula. As we have watched it, there was a remarkable transition from a serious confrontation last year to diplomacy this year. I still remember one of the renowned American specialist of international relations commenting last year that the probability of war breaking out on the Korean Peninsula is as high as 50%. In contrast, this year, we had 3 rounds of inter-Korean summit meetings, and probably we'll have the second round of USDPRK summit soon. Now, policymakers in Korea and the United States are trying hard to find the right solution for the North Korean nuclear problem. General McMaster served as the 26th US National Security Advisor from February last year to April this year, dealing with the North Korean issue in a very tough time. He's a scholar soldier with a great leadership and a strong supporter of the US-ROK alliance. He was born in Philadelphia, and his father was a Korean War veteran. General McMaster graduated US Political Academy in 1984 and later earned a PhD in American history from the University of North Carolina. His dissertation was published later as a book titled Dereliction of Duty, which has been widely read in Pentagon circles and included in military reading list. As a scholar, he worked in various capacities, such as a professor at the US Military Academy, a research fellow at the Hoover Institute, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and a consulting senior fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. As a soldier, he fought in the Gulf War, the Iraq War, and the Afghanistan War. He was awarded the Silver Star by the US government for his famous victory as a captain at the Battle of 73 Easting during the Gulf War. He also held a series of staff positions in the US Central Command and became Deputy Commanding General of the Army Training and Doctrine Command in 2012. Now he is a visiting fellow at Stanford University. Actually, I had a dinner with one of my close American friends who was visiting Seoul temporarily the day before yesterday. And I asked him to explain what kind of person General McMaster was. His answer was, quote, "He was a great leader, and I would go wherever he may want me to go, even go to war, unquote. So it's clear that he has many, many admirers in the world. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming him to the podium.
Thank you, Mr. Yoon, and thanks to Dr. Chang, to all of you, for the great privilege of being with you today. And this is really an exceptional conference, and it's a real privilege to join all of you. I think we might all agree that His Excellency Ban Ki-moon, with his statement earlier, that this year's conference is occurring at a critical time. In relation to the threat posed by North Korea, consider just the most recent events. 3 inter-Korean summits, President Trump's meeting with Kim Jong-un in Singapore, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's recent visit to Pyongyang, and the anticipated inter-Korean summit in Seoul. Secretary Pompeo just completed a candid exchange of views with counterparts in Beijing, and it's rumored that President Xi Jinping may visit Pyongyang soon. And of course, last week, Vice President Pence delivered a speech defining the threat from Chinese economic aggression and political subversion, outlining a new approach to counter hostile policies of the Chinese Communist Party. That new approach, based on the need to compete more effectively to protect our free and open societies, will require a high degree of cooperation and resolve among like-minded nations. To compete effectively, our free and open societies must re-enter arenas of competition vacated after the end of the Cold War and demonstrate a much higher degree of strategic competence. And because China is promoting a system of authoritarian capitalism while actively undermining our free and open societies, we must also demonstrate strategic confidence. Confidence in our principles and in our democratic institutions and processes. So I thought I might organize this talk around these 3 words: competition, competence, and confidence, to help frame a discussion about how to cope with these 2 significant challenges to the security of our nations and the prosperity of our peoples. As a historian, I cannot help but consider how the challenges posed by a nuclear-armed North Korea and the Chinese Communist Party's aggressive economic and security policies developed. In the 1990s, in the wake of the Soviet Union's collapse, and at the end of the Cold War, our free and open societies became complacent. Several flawed assumptions about the nature of the post-Cold War world underpinned American foreign policy and national security strategy. As President Kaljulaid observed earlier, many believed that the collapse of the Soviet Union fit into an arc of history that guaranteed the primacy of free and open systems over authoritarian and closed systems. Others defined the emerging world order in aspirational terms. We would live in a world in which geopolitical competition was a phenomenon of the past. The most optimistic predicted that a great power condominium would emerge in the post-Cold War period as international organizations foster cooperation to solve the world's most pressing problems. And drafting off these winds of optimism, U.S. policy toward China assumed that China, after being welcomed into global business and trade governance systems, would liberalize, become a trusted partner, and welcome international business into its immense market. Unrealistic assumptions also affected our approach to North Korea, especially the assumption that North Korea would change if we demonstrated strategic patience. In a recent essay in the Journal of Contemporary East Asian Studies, Jin-Wook Choi observed that the North Korean nuclear crisis stems in part from wishful thinking regarding North Korea's intentions and the failure of the international community to speak with one voice on how to resolve it. So I believe that today we are at the end of the beginning of a new era, and the United States and South Korea and the free and open societies of the world are behind because we have been too slow to abandon the wishful thinking and flawed implicit assumptions that have underpinned much of our foreign policy and economic policy since the end of the Cold War. Sadly, there is no arc of history that guarantees the security and prosperity of our free and open societies. Geopolitical competition has returned, centered on the Eurasian landmass. Russia's denial of service attacks against Estonia in 2007, but more recently, the annexation of Crimea and invasion of Ukraine changed the borders of Europe by force for the first time since World War II. China's land grab in the South China Sea, in violation of international law, and its provocative behavior there and elsewhere, such as the Senkaku Islands, have created dangerous flashpoints and a high risk of military confrontation. And even as China has succeeded economically due to its integration into the global economy and membership in the World Trade Organization, the Chinese Communist Party has not been a trusted partner. Instead, the Chinese government has used mercantilist policies, the theft and forced transfer of intellectual property, and heavy state subsidies for key enterprises and industries to enrich itself at others' expense. China's economic and security policies are integrated. For example, China uses state profits to fund a significant military buildup, offers loans with dubious terms for ports and other infrastructure in strategic locations around the world, and then takes ownership of those same locations when countries cannot service the debt. These debt for equity swaps appear to be a deliberate feature of China's One Belt, One Road strategy. One Southeast Asian leader compared Chinese loans to the unequal treaties the colonial powers foisted upon China 2 centuries ago. Moreover, Beijing aims to dominate critical and emerging sectors of the global economy through the purchase of technologies with state funds, overproduction and dumping of goods to eliminate competition, forced transfer of intellectual property in exchange for access to the Chinese market, and a sustained campaign of industrial espionage. And while we all hope that Chairman Kim Jong-un is undergoing a radical change of heart, we must remain alert to the possibility that his regime meant when it said, when its officials stated on numerous occasions, that his nuclear arsenal would constitute a treasured sword designed to pry apart the alliance between the United States and the Republic of Korea by making America think twice about ever coming to South Korea's aid in time of war. As we all know, Chairman Kim is the third in a succession of ultra-nationalist leaders whose very legitimacy rests on the promise of final victory. It is no accident that Kim spoke the term reunification, at least 11 times in his 2018 New Year's Day speech. So we must consider that North Korea may intend to hold on to these weapons because they are instrumental to achieving that final victory, which North Korea propaganda clearly states is the reunification of North and South under the Kim regime. So if we are to overcome these two major challenges and take advantage of opportunities such as those presented by the Inter-Korean dialogue and the agreement in Singapore, we must compete based on a recognition of the world as it is, not as we might like it to be. That includes a recognition of Chinese Communist Party policies and practices as they are, not as we might like to imagine them. And recognizing the world as it is requires a sober assessment of North Korean intentions. Competition, however, does not have to lead to confrontation. I don't believe in the Thucydides trap. The Thucydides trap. Indeed, if our free and open societies are passive and complacent, confrontation will become more likely as autocratic revisionist powers are emboldened and are likely to overreach. Competition also demands communication. It is indeed good that Seoul and Washington are talking with Pyongyang, and an honest dialogue with China between governments and businesses will prove critical to convincing Chinese leaders that China will benefit more from behaving as a trusted partner and working to strengthen rather than undermine the international trade and business system from which the Chinese people and the world have benefited. That is what American officials today mean when they cite the importance of competition. To compete effectively, we have to improve our strategic competence, especially our ability to integrate economic and security policy. It will be important to work through international organizations, such as the World Trade Organization, to address China's unfair trade and economic practices. The United Nations has played a critical role, the Security Council in particular, in response to North Korea's illegal nuclear weapons program. But as Mr. Chang Dae-won said in his opening comments, it is past time for like-minded nations to do more and to do more together. On China, to expose China's unfair practices and refuse to bend to Chinese coercion, succumbing to the lure of easy money, or paying for access to China's market through the transfer of intellectual property may generate profits in the near term, but will compromise sovereignty and the long-term viability of industries. And China and all responsible nations, recognizing the grave danger that a nuclear-armed North Korea poses to the world, must refuse to relax sanctions on North Korea until denuclearization. A competent response to both the challenge of North Korea's nuclear program and Chinese Communist Party policies that threaten security and prosperity requires, as previous speakers have mentioned, a high level of international cooperation. We must compete together, and we must do so with confidence. In recent years, however, experiences and the actions of strategic rivals have undermined the confidence of the United States, I would argue also South Korea, and other free and open societies. Those experiences included unanticipated difficulties encountered in what were supposed to be fast, cheap, and efficient wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the 2008 financial crisis, and the inadequate international response to the humanitarian and political catastrophe in the Middle East that is now centered on the disastrous, horrible war in Syria. Russia and China have taken advantage of and worked to aggravate our loss of confidence. Russia directs a sustained campaign of disinformation, propaganda, and political subversion against Europe and the United States. China augments its form of economic aggression with sophisticated influence campaigns in the United States and across the globe, such as those recently exposed in Australia and New Zealand. So to compete and respond competently to the threats to our free and open societies, we might make a conscious effort to rebuild our confidence. This conference, in the heart of this extraordinary city, may be the perfect place to start. What the Republic of Korea has built since 1953 is a shining example of what free and open societies can achieve. And we might draw on the examples of individuals who confronted previous challenges and created tremendous opportunities for future generations. Korea endured great suffering under colonial rule, but Korea's heroes helped overcome that suffering as well as an invasion from the north. They built what surrounds us today. We might draw confidence from their example. To prepare for my participation in this conference, I read about one of those heroes, Yu Guan-soon. You know her story, I'm sure. When she and her parents demonstrated for Korean independence, her parents were killed, and she ended up in prison at the age of 16. Even under torture, she refused to betray her fellow demonstrators and was kept behind bars until she died a year later. I'm sure that most of you have seen the famous photograph of her taken in prison. There's so much sadness in that face and so much courage. Yu Guan-soon died for Korea, but she also died for the freedoms we hold dear. Freedom of speech and freedom of worship, and she died for principles that bind our free and open societies to one another. Yu Guan-soon is a Korean hero, but today we might invoke her to inspire us all. Inspire us to work together to overcome today's challenges. It is natural that Koreans should look back in anger on a traumatic past. It is also natural to get angry when anyone denies the horrors that the Korean people endured. But now is a time of challenges that demand friendship and confidence among today's democracies, democracies that share a devotion to freedom, rule of law, and human rights. If we allow the past to divide us, we may lack the confidence and strength to overcome today's challenges, to our security, to our prosperity, and to our freedom. As you know, over 100,000 American soldiers lost their lives in the Pacific War. Another 250,000 U.S. soldiers were wounded. Every American family had someone in harm's way during World War II. Americans will never forget the sacrifices of our troops and the horrors and brutality they faced. But the day after Japan's surrender in 1945, America extended the hand of friendship to the Japanese people. Today, the alliance between the U.S. and Japan is as strong as if we had never been enemies. So as we compete to build a better world for our children and grandchildren, we should remember our history, but let us live in the present and look forward, especially at a time when we face common threats. Yu Guan-soon wanted to be a teacher. She would have made a great one. She knew the value of free speech, of education, and she knew the difference between real education and propaganda. And because she was a person of deep religious faith, we might imagine that she would not have wanted South Korea to bear an eternal grudge against today's Japan, a liberal democratic country, very unlike the Japan that took her life. I can imagine that she would understand that today's challenges demand not only confidence in our individual nations, but also confidence in our free and open systems that bind us together. Confidence among nations that share liberal democratic principles is important to preserve peace. We should remember why Kim Il-sung decided to launch an invasion in June of 1950. He did so because he believed the South Korean people didn't support their republic and didn't feel much solidarity with other democracies either. He thought South Koreans would put nationalism above their freedom. He was sure that once his troops took Seoul, the rest of the country would welcome them with open arms. He also thought America would not fight to preserve South Korea's freedom. It was a costly war that took the lives of too many Koreans, American soldiers, and soldiers from other countries. But we remained confident in our ability to prevail. My father, as was mentioned, was among the many veterans of that war. He remained proud of his service in defense of freedom and the Korean people. Confidence in our principles and our free and open systems, however, should not breed complacency. I've seen in the news that some people say we don't need to station THAAD anti-missile batteries here because it only protects the American troops. They speak as if those American troops were not here to protect South Korea. I also read that some South Koreans are saying we shouldn't fight no matter what the North does. Some seem to want to start an argument between friends that could precipitate a breakup in the alliance that has prevented war on the peninsula for 65 years. Let me assure you, America doesn't want to keep any country in a military alliance it doesn't want. Because when you have one unwilling partner or a partner with divided loyalties, the alliance fails to serve its whole purpose, which is deterring the enemy and keeping the peace. But I believe that most South Koreans remain committed to our alliance. We fought one devastating war on this peninsula because the regime in Pyongyang thought the South lacked confidence and would not defend itself. We might recognize that making good on the opportunities associated with the inter-Korean dialogue and the follow-up to the Singapore summit will require a clear communication of confidence and resolve to North Korea around 3 points. First, continue to ensure alignment between the Republic of Korea and U.S. efforts. The key will be to recognize that movement on inter-Korean relations cannot outpace concrete action by North Korea to denuclearize. We must avoid mistakes of the past by adhering to the joint pledge that there be no sanction relief absent the final, fully verified denuclearization of North Korea. And together, we should emphasize that denuclearization would open the way to tremendous cooperation with North Korea, if cooperation is what the North Korean regime wants. Second, make clear that the obligation under the United Nations Security Council resolution is for North Korean action, not U.S. and South Korean so-called confidence-building measures or concessions. And third, remind North Korea of the fleeting opportunity presented by this unprecedented alignment of 4 critical constituencies prepared to support enhanced U.S.-North Korean engagement and a fundamental shift in relations if North Korea denuclearizes. These constituencies are the United States President, the Republican Party, the Democratic Party in the United States, and the Republic of Korea. Our advice to Pyongyang should be, do not lose this opportunity. Even if we stay aligned and put forward our best effort, it is not unimaginable that tensions could increase. The North Korean weapons of mass destruction program is the issue most likely to cause future conflict because it threatens not only South Korea, Japan, and the United States, but all nations. That is because a nuclearized North Korea could collapse the non-proliferation regime in Asia and beyond. And of course, the North Korean regime has never met a weapon that it did not try to sell to somebody else. It is for that reason that all nations, including China, and maybe especially China, must make clear to the North that its nuclear program does not enhance North Korean security. It makes North Korea vulnerable and will result in missing a tremendous opportunity for enduring peace and prosperity. While we all hope that Chairman Kim Jong-un is undergoing a radical change of heart to help make that hope a reality, we must remain alert to the possibility that his regime meant what it said when its officials stated on numerous occasions that his nuclear arsenal is this treasured sword designed to pry apart the alliance between the United States and the Republic of Korea. President Moon's and President Trump's bold diplomatic foray could turn out to be the beginning of a brighter and better future for the people of North Korea and for the Peninsula and the region as a whole. I once bore witness to a dramatic shift in a geopolitical landscape that many did not think possible. In October of 1989, our cavalry regiment was patrolling the border near Coburg, West Germany, when East Germany lifted travel restrictions to the west. That day, we experienced an invasion, but it was an invasion of an unanticipated kind. As joyous East Germans brought us flowers and wine to celebrate reunions with friends and family and their newfound freedom. Those moments remain among my fondest memories when freedom triumphed over oppression. And it is equally moving to see families reunited here. But my message is that we must proceed carefully to make the most of this opportunity. And we might remember, even as guard posts along the DMZ are gradually removed and the landmines are unearthed, it will be more difficult to erase the conceptual line that divides two very different systems. What President Trump described in his address before the South Korean Assembly as a line that runs between decency and depravity, between law and tyranny, between hope and total despair. So I look forward to discussing with you how we might compete more effectively, improve our strategic competence, and remain confident as we work together to overcome challenges to the security and prosperity of our free and open societies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, General McMaster, for your very clear and powerful message, emphasizing the importance of free and open system that binds us together. And I also liked your historical examples going back to the story of Yu Kwan-sun, Korean martyr and patriot a century ago. You tried to withdraw some important implication for us living today. And since you were working at the center of security policy making in the United States, I cannot resist the temptation to ask this sobering question. How close were we to a war on the Korean Peninsula last year?
Okay, thank you. And thank you again for the privilege of being with all of you. I do not think we were close to war at that time, but we were on a path to war. And the reason we were on a path to war is that we were testing this assumption that through this campaign of maximum pressure, this thesis really, that we could convince Kim Jong-un that actually his weapons, these weapons were making him less secure, not more secure, and that the only way for him to escape this kind of tightening grip around the North would be to denuclearize. And of course, we didn't, who knew what the chances of that were going to be. But what we also recognized at the time, though, is that there cannot be a bold line between exclusively a diplomatic approach, or an approach that entails the use of sanctions, and military preparedness and strengthening our alliance. I think it was very critical for us to convey to Kim Jong-un, with with our great allies in South Korea, that every step he took toward a nuclear weapon, he was driving us closer to each other, and he was driving all of the rest of the international community away from him, including China. And I think the initial actions of President Xi were critical in this connection as well, as were the actions by the UN Security Council, with an unprecedented range of sanctions applied to the North. And I think, as President Moon has said, that it was this combination of diplomatic activity, of sanctions, but really the common goal of communicating to Kim Jong-un that it was not in his interest to continue this program that created the opportunities we're seeing now. But I think equally critical, of course, is going to be the follow-up to ensure that North Korea isn't able to do what, as all of you know very well, what they've done in the past, enter into a period of negotiations to create the illusion of progress, use that illusion of progress to convince us to alleviate the pressure, and then have a long, drawn-out negotiation process that delivers a very weak agreement, which then North Korea immediately breaks, and locks in the status quo as the new normal. And so I think these are risks we have to look at in a very clear-eyed way, and maintain the very close relationship between the presidents of our two countries, but the international cooperation, as I alluded to, including Japan, other countries, but China as well. And as I mentioned, I'm sorry to go on about this, and I'll be more succinct. We said from the beginning that we were not going to go to China and ask China to do the United States and South Korea a favor in enforcing the sanctions against North Korea. What we wanted to do is to have a discussion about our mutual interests. And I think it was clear from those discussions that a breakdown of the non-proliferation regime, I mean, imagine if Japan concludes at some stage that it needs a nuclear weapon. Then what if South Korea concludes that it needs a nuclear weapon? I mean, you could imagine Vietnam, Taiwan. I mean, that is not in Chinese interest. It's not in Russian. It's not in anybody's interest. And so I think we are still at a very critical point. It is. I feel better about it because there are more options available now, more opportunities than I did a year ago, certainly.
Thank you very much. Actually, you have addressed the question I would like to ask. That is, in your presentation, you kind of defined China as a competitor. And actually, in the public document like U.S. National Security Strategy, they defined China as a competitor, which is unprecedented. And it seems to be the case from a global perspective because there has been going on some competition in various areas like on trade issues and in South China Sea, on the Taiwan issues or something like that. The dilemma is we need full cooperation from China in denuclearizing North Korea, as well as settling permanent peace on the Korean Peninsula. Many people in this country are concerned about the possible spillover of negative impact of strategic competition between the United States and China on nuclear diplomacy on Korea. I mean, what do you think about that dilemma? Will there be no way of handling this kind of dilemma between global strategic competition between two countries and nuclear diplomacy on Korea?
You know, the response in China to the trade enforcement actions that the president has taken, the vice president's speech, has been to allege that the United States wants to keep China down, doesn't want China to rise and to continue to prosper in the way that it has in recent years. And as Vice President Pence made clear in his speech, that is not the case at all. In fact, the world benefits tremendously from economic growth in China, from the tremendous industry of the Chinese people, the vastness of the Chinese market. But what cannot be tolerated anymore are the unfair trade and economic practices that disadvantage our economies. And you see this with the recent news on the extraction of intellectual property through espionage. But of course, this is a very systematic effort on the part of China to dominate whole sectors of the global economy, and to do it in a way that's just unfair. So at the beginning of the remarks here, there was an insinuation that the U.S. use of trade enforcement actions was against free, fair, and reciprocal trade. No, in fact, those trade enforcement actions are taken to preserve free, fair, and reciprocal trade. And so what should occur is that those unfair trade and economic practices, such as forced transfer of intellectual property, the joint venture law, it should be able to lead to a reduction of tariffs if those unfair trade policies are addressed. With addressing these unfair trade and economic practices, really a form of, I think, economic aggression on the part of China, should not be seen as in tension with what all of us have to do together on North Korea. And I think there are really three different C's, words, that I think ought to bound our relationship with China. And the first of these is cooperation, to find areas of cooperation. I mean, we should, if we map our interests, if we look at where our interests align in some really critical areas on North Korea, but our interests also align in South Asia in connection with Pakistan's support for transnational terrorist organizations and for the Taliban. China's investment in infrastructure on the continent, the Eurasian continent, it could be jeopardized by a state that supports these types of terrorist organizations. And so that's another area in which our interests align. And I would say our interests should align in the South China Sea if China recognizes that it's been freedom of navigation and the fact that nobody owns the ocean that has helped facilitate China's economic growth. So cooperation is the first C. Competition is the second, as I mentioned. And actually, I think competition is critical to preventing the third C, which is confrontation. We don't want to have confrontation. But if we don't compete, if we don't make clear what our interests are and what we will do to protect and advance our vital interests, in that vacuum is where I think we could encourage nations, aggressive nations, rival nations, to be too aggressive and overstep. And I don't have any evidence for this, but I would just ask you to consider what happened after the so-called red line in Syria went unenforced by the United States. And I think what you saw is maybe a direct line to Russian intervention in Syria, which propped up the murderous Assad regime and facilitated what Iran is doing across the region. And then you saw the annexation of Crimea, you saw the invasion of Ukraine, and you also saw the dramatic the intensification and acceleration of the reclamation efforts in the South China Sea as well. So I think competition is a way to preserve peace and to prevent confrontation.
Thank you very much. Many observers and policymakers last year worried about North Korean nuclear threat, and they thought that North Korea may really use nuclear weapons to strike other countries for some reasons. For example, they may not know where the rule of game, I mean nuclear game, between or among nuclear states, or because of the weak conventional capabilities on their side. And I think you were one of them who were worried much about this nuclear threat. And nowadays, since the beginning of this year, the situation has changed. Chairman Kim Jong-un declared to the outside world, as well as his own domestic residents, that he would make denuclearized North Korea, and he would concentrate on economic development from now on. And what do you think about this? I mean, have you changed your evaluation of Chairman Kim Jong-un's intention after watching, I mean, what has been going on in the last 10 months? Or, I mean, you have not changed your view on his intention?
I think the best answer I can give you is I just don't know. And the case I was trying to make in the remarks is we just need a sober assessment of what his intentions might be and keep open to the range of possibilities associated with those intentions. As I mentioned, previous public statements by his regime were that this would be the sword that would break apart the U.S.-South Korean alliance. Other statements indicated that he would use it as blackmail to drive the United States off the peninsula as the first step in driving South Korea down through maybe conventional force, but fifth column activities. I mean, these are all theories at this stage. But we have to consider really the range of what his intentions might be, and craft a policy that allows us to confirm his intentions, I think, before any of the pressure on the regime, the economic pressure, the sanctions are alleviated. But as I mentioned as well, continuing to hold open that prospect of tremendous benefits to him and especially the North Korean people if he were to denuclearize.
Yes. When we try to resolve the crisis situation, I think perception matters. Deterrence is important, but also at the same time, perception matters. What I'm saying is, as far as our perception of North Korea's intention matters, I think North Korea's perception of our intention matters too. In that regard, I think a country like North Korea, a small and weak country, diplomatically isolated, economically devastated, and that kind of country, surrounded by big powers, may feel very insecure, even though its neighboring countries have no intention to attack them. So perception matters. In other words, without making Chairman Kim Jong-un to believe that he can survive and prosper without nuclear weapons, probably he will not give up their nuclear weapons. So I think in this regard, politically engaging North Korea is very important because it can reduce the tension and heighten the level of mutual trust and prepare a better environment, political and diplomatic environment for solving this problem. So that's the reason why I support President Trump's policy of engaging North Korea politically and diplomatically. Having said that, I think declaration of peace or establishing of liaison office or intersection, as former DIA John Clapper mentioned, would be a very productive way of preparing a better political environment in which Chairman Kim Jong-un goes to the road of denuclearizing North Korea. What do you think about these concrete measures, as a kind of inducement for North Korea's denuclearization? What I'm saying is U.S. still keeps most important instrument, that is economic sanction. U.S. policymakers may keep that card in their hands until North Korea takes decisive measure in terms of denuclearization while engaging North Korea politically and diplomatically by establishing this kind of liaison office or declaring peace. What do you think?
Well, first of all, I agree with your assessment that Kim Jong-un has to see an alternative to, to the end of the regime if he denuclearizes, and I think that was clear from the president's speech that he gave to the National Assembly, and has been clear in all the public statements that the United States has made as we have participated in this international campaign of maximum pressure. In terms of alleviating tensions, I think that you're absolutely right, that this is one of the benefits of the dialogue and the discussions that have occurred, and is a positive. And it is a positive, though, if the reduction of tensions is also accompanied by, by maintaining our resolve and really clear description of and not just in words, or depiction, not just in words, but in actions to the North, that we're not going to prematurely alleviate that pressure until denuclearization happens. So I think that there is a tension there at times that has to be resolved, and that ought to be resolved mainly through very close coordination, I think, among the allies. On the issue that you raise on declaring an end of the war and so forth, I'll leave that up to President Trump and President Moon and others. I haven't studied enough to figure out how that fits in to, I think, those twin objectives that are sometimes in tension of alleviating tensions, showing him, there is an alternative, right, after denuclearization, but then also not alleviating the pressure prematurely, or allowing him to do what has been a goal of the regime for a long time, is to break apart the alliance.
I'm a strong supporter of US-ROK alliance, as you are, because I believe in the value such as democracy, freedom and human rights, open system, etc. And I think probably most Koreans think that way too, and they support alliance relationship with the United States. We are concerned about President Trump's statement that he would withdraw American troops someday in the future from Korea. What do you think? Is he the person who believes in the values like that? Democracy and freedom and alliance, and is he concerned about the future of alliance between the United States and ROK?
Well, this all goes to really how different parties in the United States view America's role in the world. As I mentioned, we're at the beginning of the end of a new era. And I think all of us have to define what our roles are as free and open societies. And there is a tone through just the opening sessions, which I'm not being critical, but I'm just observing that is very critical of the United States. The United States' disengagement from the world. The United States not supporting free, fair, and reciprocal trade. I really reject that, actually. I think that it was America's disengagement from the world, maybe even more so in the previous administration, that has contributed to some of the problems that we're facing today. And so you have dynamics within the Republican Party and the Democratic Party that tend toward disengagement. It's always been that way. Ever since the end of World War II, there have been these debates. And I think what's important is important for our allies and partners to communicate when it's appropriate to do so, the value of our alliance and the value of U.S. engagement. Because I do believe that it has been U.S. engagement as part of a broader community of like-minded nations that has prevented great power conflict for over 70 years, that has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. So I think that we ought to be unapologetic about what we have accomplished together, and then we have to craft a vision that addresses what you might call a retrenchment movement in the Democratic Party. And I think that you might say in the Republican Party there is a strain of isolationism. Again, like as you described the politics in your country vis-a-vis the alliance, I do believe the vast majority of Americans in both parties believe in sustained engagement among like-minded countries to protect and advance our freedoms, and to protect and advance and preserve peace, to advance prosperity for all of our people. So I think we share that commitment. We ought to maybe spend more time talking about the virtues of the U.S. engagement and partnerships, and a little less time in what I call maybe a form of self-flagellation that we engage in.
Let me take this chance to ask another question about the possibility of President Trump striking a deal with the United States, incomplete deal. I mean, North Korea, dismantle ICBM facilities, and the U.S. acquiesce North Korea to keep, their nuclear warheads or something like that. Will that kind of, deal possible in the future? Some, Korean specialists are concerned about that possibility.
Yeah, I think you should be concerned about that possibility. I just don't think that would be good for the world. As I mentioned, this could lead to a breakdown of the non-proliferation regime, but it could also lead to North Korea selling a nuclear weapon. I mean, there hasn't been enough attention paid, I don't think, to the Israeli strike on the Syrian nuclear reactor that occurred several years ago. That was a North Korean facility attempting to arm the Assad regime with nuclear weapons. And so imagine a nuclear device being given to a terrorist organization. Certainly that's not in the U.S., China's, Russia's, anybody's interest. So I believe it's in the interest of all nations to ensure complete and irreversible denuclearization. And that's, I think because the threat is not just from an ICBM, the threat could be from other forms of delivery, and of course, as I mentioned, the effect it would have on the non-proliferation regime as well. And to this argument you sometimes hear that, well, North Korea has this for defensive purposes and they can be deterred. North Korea had a huge deterrent capability, and still does, in its conventional capabilities and its conventional artillery in particular, and the proximity of Seoul to the border. North Korea did not need nuclear weapons to deter any kind of attack on them. And in fact, we know clearly from the historical record that every act of aggression since June of 1950, right, has been taken by North Korea, not by South Korea or the United States or anybody else.
Thank you very much. I think it's time for us to wrap up our session, and I deeply appreciate your kind and candid and strong views on this issue. And please join me in thanking General McMaster.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you very much, sir, Mr. McMaster, and Professor Yoon Young-kwan for an excellent session. Let's have another round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. Of course, next on our program is the session Views of Uber and NASA on Air Mobility Revolution, which will begin following a short break. Please be back in your seats. Thank you very much.